participate in those elections. As a result of this consolidation of power, there is growing public discontent with the authorities. In public opinion polls conducted by IRI, respondents were asked if they would support the freezing of assets and banning of visas of Ukrainian officials, including judges, that engaged in corruption. 82% responded in the affirmative that they would support such moves. These are dramatic figures, Mr. Chairman. We see this nowhere else in the region, and I think it speaks to the level of discontent that is emerging in Ukraine. In November, Ukraine's parliament adopted a law on parliamentary elections. The new law establishes a mixed system, which is a return to the system last used in 2002. It establishes a 5% threshold for any political party to be represented in Parliament and does not allow electoral blocs to compete in the election. The Venice Commission strongly criticized this draft parliamentary election law. Unfortunately, the Commission's analysis was mostly ignored. Its report was critical of the change to the mixed system. It advocated an open party list system. It also expressed concern about unclear criteria and deadlines for the designation of election districts, a lack of clarity on appealing results of elections, and an absence of full disclosure on sources and sums of election campaign funding. Now, with regard to the upcoming elections, I just wanted to give you and the members a bit of a preview on how things are shaping up. According to IRI polling data, it appears that 6 political parties will likely pass the 5% threshold. Those are the Party of Regions, Batkivshina or Fatherland Party, Front of Change, the Ukrainian Democratic Alliance for Reform, the Communist Party, and the Freedom Party. Many parties are starting to coalesce. Strong Ukraine political party has merged with the Party of Regions, and the opposition is also seeking to coalesce. Batkivshina and Front for Change have united in a single list of candidates for the single mandate districts and are currently in discussions with the UDAR political party. However, leading up to these elections, government officials have intensified their pressure on multiple sectors of Ukrainian society, and I'd like to speak about 3 of those: media, civil society organizations, and the political opposition. With regard to the media, Mr. Chairman, one of the preeminent legacies of the Orange Revolution was a free and vibrant media. Soon after assuming power in 2010, the current government directly and indirectly pressured the media to limit critical coverage and report more positively on the government. In addition, one of the country's deputy prime ministers is the owner of the largest media conglomerate in Ukraine, known as Inter. The government has tried to censor TV state companies. In civil society, the Ukrainian government has begun to more closely monitor and regulate the activities of NGOs, including those of IRI. A Cabinet of Ministers decree signed in January of 2011 amends the registration regulations in Ukraine, making it easier to deregister international civil society organizations and placing a much higher reporting requirements on their grantees. With regard to the opposition, you've already heard from several today about the marginalization and the political persecution of political figures. I won't go into that any further. I would like to share with you some of the things that IRI is doing to try to strengthen democracy in Ukraine. IRI has had a long-standing program in Ukraine. We support the promotion of democracy in Ukraine. And we try to address the above-referenced challenges and respond to Ukraine's rapidly deteriorating political environment, and by working to strengthen political parties, foster mechanisms for good governance, support the next generation of political activists, and develop a more transparent electoral system. To assist in the development of Ukraine's electoral processes, IRI has conducted international election observation missions, observing every parliamentary and presidential election in Ukraine since it became independent in 1991. As far as next steps, Mr. Chairman, let me summarize by saying I'd like to reiterate the importance of the upcoming elections. Elections are critical for Ukraine's continued integration into Euro-Atlantic structures. Failure to conduct elections which meet international standards will cause Ukraine to be further isolated from the West. We encourage the U.S. Congress to continue to make it clear to the Ukrainian government that free and fair elections will determine the course of the future relationship between our 2 countries. In anticipation of the possibility of excessive fraud in the parliamentary elections, we call on Ukrainian authorities to support international election observation missions and to allow district and regional election commissioners to conduct their work independent of pressure and intimidation from central authorities. In summary, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to thank you and the members for focusing on the parliamentary elections. The way in which elections are conducted in Ukraine are every bit as important as the outcome. So I thank you again, and I'll be prepared to answer any questions you might have.
Mr. Nix, thank you so very much for your testimony. Ms. Fox.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and distinguished members of the Commission. I want to apologize for my voice. I'm getting over a cold, but I'm not contagious. But thank you for this opportunity to comment on next October's Ukrainian parliamentary elections. I want to note that this is a particularly important time to be holding this hearing. Although the election is still several months off, there are important decisions being made right now. Ukraine's Constitutional Court recently invalidated parts of the parliamentary election law. The very important territorial and precinct election commissions will soon be chosen. OPORA, which is the major domestic nonpartisan election monitoring group, is beginning to issue reports, and the political parties with which NDI and IRI work are making their plans for protecting electoral integrity. Moreover, of course, as you know, it is established international practice to evaluate all parts of the election cycle, not only election day, but the broader electoral context that affects the character and quality of elections. In fact, both the Ukrainian government and its critics agree that this election should be viewed in broader political context. The Ukrainian government asserts that it is preparing to hold a fully democratic election, one that will demonstrate its ability to balance strong, centralized governance with democratic values sufficient to justify European Union membership for Ukraine. Unfortunately, this notion of balance remains wishful thinking, despite the efforts of some well-intentioned people in the current government. In the electoral arena, as my colleague Steve Nix has noted, there was a promising start when a democratic election was held in 2010, and President Yanukovych came to power. Since then, as my colleagues also noted, the only nationwide elections under the current administration, the local elections in fall 2010, were flawed in the view of credible domestic and international observers. That tainted performance undermined confidence among the opposition that this government would uphold international and domestic standards for fair elections. Very long and unfortunately opaque deliberations over a new parliamentary election law fueled further mistrust in the electoral process. And, as has been noted, in a recent troubling development, international observers were not allowed to monitor critical aspects of the election vote count in March in a local election in the Kiev suburb of Buki. As several people have already commented, the last 2 years have seen a general deterioration of political pluralism in Ukraine. The ruling party has taken control over most institutions of government. In addition to the parliamentary election law, the last 2 years have seen, of course, the jailing of the most popular opposition politician, Ms. Tymoshenko, constitutional changes to strengthen the presidency relative to parliament, and greatly expanded control by the ruling party of regions over local governments, as well as law enforcement and regulatory bodies. Ukraine's courts, including the constitutional courts, have rebuffed challenges to all of these changes. And in David's organization, Freedom House, which puts out the very influential Freedom in the World Index, Ukraine dropped from free to partly free under this current government. At the same time, Ukraine still benefits from strong democratic voices and alternative points of view. For example, in the election law debate, the opposition parties were able to marshal media and public attention, and they were able to negotiate significant changes into the law. This presence of a viable opposition sets Ukraine apart from most of its ex-Soviet neighbors. And it is this multi-party system that may be undermined if the October elections are seriously flawed. The international community can and should use both words and deeds to guard against the further erosion of democratic rights in Ukraine. But the primary driver of change, however, must be Ukrainians themselves. There should be no mistaking Ukrainians' desires. A common refrain you hear among certain commentators is that Ukrainians are either apathetic about their political life or ready to sacrifice democratic institution and principles for a, quote, strong hand in governance. Neither is true, and they both do a disservice to Ukrainians' aspirations. While it is true that citizens express disappointment with their political leaders, they do care about the direction of the country, which is evidenced by the growing numbers who are participating in peaceful protests. Recent increases in demonstrations and in the so-called protest mood have been documented by pollsters and by civil society, including an NDI partner, the Center for Society Research. The all-too-common wisdom that Ukrainians will sacrifice democracy for progress on bread-and-butter issues is also false. Ukrainian civic groups have successfully married the two concerns in an advocacy campaign on the freedom of assembly. Thousands of Ukrainians have signed petitions that call upon the government to allow freedom of assembly as a means of protecting their economic rights. Polling supported by NDI along with Lake Research Associates prior to this petition campaign showed that Ukrainians are well aware of threats to democracy and to individual civil liberties, notably political influence over the judiciary, a topic we've discussed today. As the election approaches, Ukrainian civil society will become more active, particularly in monitoring and reporting on threats to electoral integrity. 5 key issues are most important to restoring some measure of credibility to Ukraine's electoral process. I will list them here. 1, government impartiality in the administration of the elections. This means no misuse of governmental resources and authority in support of a candidate or party, including abuse of taxing or licensing and regulatories of government, or governmental pressure on courts involved in such things as candidate registration. 2, campaign environment in which candidates, campaign activists, and observers can operate free of harassment and intimidation. 3, transparent and equitable formation of territorial and precinct election commissions. 4, respect for and adherence to the legal framework for the election and for the compromise that was negotiated between government opposition, the law was ultimately passed. Finally, 5, a post-election environment free from pressure or incentives to induce deputies to switch allegiances. It's important to note that this, in particular, was a major problem following the 2002 parliamentary elections, the last time that Ukraine used a single mandate system, as they are for half the seats this time. The opposition party in that election won the greatest number of seats because of post-election defections. The pro-governmental bloc eventually was able to form a parliamentary majority. Observers from Opora have been monitoring in every oblast since early April. In July, Opora will deploy additional observers to the 225 electoral districts, and on election day, it will field up to 3,500 observers. With NDI's technical support, Opora will be able to draw accurate conclusions about the fairness of the election nationwide based on observation in a statistically representative sample of polling places. Opora will be reporting on electoral processes and incidents, not just in monthly press conferences, but also as they are happening in real time. It will employ sophisticated data visualization techniques to display maps of electoral violations online. It will circulate reports using email and social networks. All of these efforts will enable Ukrainian citizens and international groups to react immediately to electoral problems and events. Opora will also work with other groups to post verified reports from ordinary citizens using what's called crowdsourcing techniques that were so important in recent Russian elections. Of course, in all these efforts, the organization Opora will cooperate with the OSCE and other nonpartisan domestic and international election monitoring groups. In addition to Opora, NDI hopes to support a monitoring effort by the European Network of Election Monitoring Organizations. This is a network of the leading nonpartisan monitoring groups from the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Its members, who have observed a number of previous Ukrainian elections, are well versed in Ukraine's electoral processes. Opora, NMO, and other monitors can give Ukrainians crucial information that they need so that they are able to demand from their government clean elections as part of a genuine, long-term commitment to democracy. We hope that all of those here who care about Ukraine help to amplify the findings of these credible credible monitoring groups. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, members of the Commission, for holding this hearing and for the opportunity to speak. And there's a schedule of OPOR's reports that on the table out there for people who want to follow.
Ms. Fox, thank you very much for struggling through with your difficult cold and voice, and thank you for doing that. One quick question before Mr. Kramer, and all of you, I would ask the same thing, but after, of course, the next witness. You've mentioned the leaders have no plans, or some of the leaders have no plans to go to Euro 2012. What about teams? Is that something that should be promoted, that teams ought to boycott this?
It's a great question. I am inclined to keep the teams out of this and have this decided at the political level. I think the teams are looking forward to participating in these games, and I think enough of a political statement will be made by political leaders and heads of state deciding not to go.
Thank you.
And my apologies, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
And have a nice trip. Mr. Wiese, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, members and staff of the Commission. I'd like to ask that my full written statement, as well as some other materials, which I will refer to in this presentation, be included in the record.
Without objection, it will be so ordered.
Thank you. IFAS is an independent nonprofit leader in election assistance and democracy promotion. In Ukraine, we have provided support to nascent electoral institutions, offered legislative assistance to fundamental laws, and worked with a range of civil society groups and experts to improve the quality and transparency of elections in the country. I would like to begin today by first sincerely thanking the Commission for inviting IFAS to speak, and in fact, all of us to speak, but more so for simply holding this event. Over the past few years, the organizations represented here today have followed closely events in Ukraine with an eye towards this October's parliamentary election. As we have now already heard, problems arising in the 2010 local elections, some recent developments in election law for this election, the subsequent deterioration of rights and freedoms, the much publicized and seemingly selective political persecution of former government and current opposition figures have all collectively fueled our growing concern over how free, fair, and credible these elections may be. I will focus my remarks on the legal framework and administration of elections. In doing so, I touch upon a number of new or persisting weaknesses in the electoral legislation. I draw your attention to recent developments in preparation for October's election, and I briefly highlight some additional issues that may surface in the coming months based on IFAS's own observations and work in the country. On the heels of that 2010 local elections, which we've referred to a number of times now, President Yanukovych announced his intent to embark on comprehensive electoral reform. And there was soon considerable disappointment when it was clear that the government made many key decisions, including a change to the electoral system, even before the working group on election reform held its initial meeting. Out of this process that lasted a few to several months, a new draft parliamentary election law was eventually put forward. IFAS, together with the Council of Europe, Venice Commission, and OSCE ODIHR, drew attention to both positive and negative provisions in the law. The final version of the law largely reflected this draft law, with some notable exceptions. And it is, of course, this law which now will regulate these elections in October. In Ukraine's new parliamentary election system, half the deputies will be elected through proportional representation according to a nationwide vote, and half will be elected in winner-takes-all electoral constituencies, not unlike our elections, for example, for the House of Representatives. Inherently, there's nothing right or wrong in such a system. However, I would like to draw your attention to the last time such a system was in place, exactly 10 years ago, as was mentioned today, this being the 2002 parliamentary elections. These elections were held at a time of a government waning in popularity, yet they eventually produced somewhat surprising results to the benefit of the pro-government political force, to the point of it successfully retaining significant control of the legislature. The pro-governmental, pro-presidential parties achieved this feat largely, or partially certainly, by doing extraordinarily well in these single-member districts, disproportionately so. The commonly held assertion among experts and academics at the time, and indeed still, was that in some cases, administrative resource use and control of certain territorial regions and resources helped ensure a victory for the pro-governmental candidates where the pro-governmental party did not enjoy a plurality of voter support. Now, I bring up this point because today in Ukraine, we have a similar scenario unfolding. A parallel election system is now firmly in place. A number of polls, as you've heard here today, and including IFAS's own from 2 weeks ago, show the support for the ruling party in Ukraine is in decline. So in a sense, we have the similar mix as we had in 2002. On one hand, a governing force that's waning in popular support, which on the other is about to compete in an election where half the seats will be determined through these single-member districts. Of course, we can conclude nothing at this time, nor should we, but the parallel is striking and must not be dismissed. A more technical issue we're just now confronted with in the last few weeks concerns the boundaries of those new single-member districts. It is difficult to assess the Central Election Commission's performance in creating boundaries only because the law included just 3 brief sub-articles to regulate this process. We should also point out that between the initial draft of the new law and the final version, one of the only provisions in the law to regulate this process, that districts must at least be contiguous, was inexplicably removed. Not surprisingly, in examining the new boundaries, we see that there are districts which are non-contiguous. By international standards, there are very few reasons for justifiably doing this, and such reasons do not appear to apply in these cases. IFAS, together with civil society partners, is now working on a comprehensive technical analysis of the districts, which it hopes to release in the coming week. How the districts may have been drawn in terms of political intentions will require some degree of insight into Ukrainian politics, but certainly this will come to light in the days, weeks, and months to come. An additional area to watch relates to the formation of district and polling station election commissions, which are essentially the chief electoral bodies for their respective areas. In Ukraine, all commissioners are nominated by a political entity. Because of the number of parties and candidates expected to keep heat for these elections, places on these commissions will be at a premium and largely decided by a lottery. On April 29th, the CEC adopted a lottery procedure that could severely hamper parties' chances of obtaining these valuable district commission places and is contrary to an earlier IFAS recommendation. In addition, the time frame for a political entity to submit candidates for the commission is extremely tight, just 3 days, with any nomination returned for correction needing to be resubmitted the following day. We are concerned that political entities may forfeit their commission nominees simply because they will not learn until later that there was an issue with their initial submission. In terms of electoral administration, let me begin by saying the CEC of Ukraine has an unenviable task in preparing up to 500,000 temporary election commissioners in a matter of just a few weeks. The CEC will also be burdened with many other tasks in the upcoming months, for example, registering candidates on party lists and accrediting thousands of local and international nonpartisan observers and thousands more candidate and party proxies and observers. Beyond these logistical challenges, we recall in Ukraine election commissions are de facto not independent from political influence, as they are formed by the political entities and whose interests they de facto represent on the commission. Such a concern has been raised by international organizations such as the OSCE ODIHR. Finally, I would point to a few additional issues to be cognizant of in the upcoming campaign and election. First is the possibility that voters will be able to use the option in Ukraine of voting in their current temporary place of location to strategically change their place of voting, meaning from one district to another. This was a potential issue that we raised in one of our earlier analyses of the draft law, and we simply believe that it should be closely monitored. Second concerns the commonly recognized phenomenon that all major political entities receive considerable financial and other resources from Ukraine's wealthiest benefactors. The new parliamentary election law does very little to bring transparency to these relationships, requiring only the modest basic level of disclosure and leaves ample room for campaign costs to be hidden as third-party expenditures or services in kind. Third, election day itself may well complicated by unwieldy procedures that need to be clarified by the CEC in advance of the election. And finally, there exist the ever-present possibilities in Ukraine of abuses of state resources, vote-buying schemes, and other illegal practices that can thrive with impunity under a weak system of law enforcement. Now let me conclude by stating what the international community, including the United States, could do to support consolidation of democracy in Ukraine through a transparent, competitive, and credible election this October. First, I would say don't take your eye off the ball now. Over the next few months, important developments will take place that will surely tell us how transparent, credible, and evenly contested these elections might be. I urge you all to stay focused on the issues raised today by myself and all the colleagues, and those that may come to light in the upcoming weeks and months. To this end, it is of course vital for the U.S. and the larger international community to pay close attention to and respond to election administration and observation needs, and through statements from entities such as your own to continue to show that the U.S. is supportive of a democratic, free, and fair election in Ukraine. Second and finally, I urge you not to take your eye off the ball later. Ukraine fatigue in the West has correlated positively with the government's recidivism with respect to human rights, obvious aggression towards political rivals, and efforts to solidify a hold on power. For our part, IFES has and will continue to advocate for improved democratic election legislation and practices in compliance with international standards. Now, despite issues or concerns raised today, I would say that we certainly do not know what the outcome of these elections will be. But however the conduct and whatever the outcomes, it will be necessary to continue to engage Ukraine. And of course, the performance in these elections will in large part determine just how that engagement may take shape. Thank you all for the opportunity to testify today, and I am happy to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wiese, for indicating what's happening now, but equally important when you talked about and admonished us to keep our eye on the ball, what to look out for. And I can assure you this commission will stay very, very focused, but your words, I think, are very important. That with all the issues in the world today, we need not lose focus, and Kiev needs to be very well aware of it, at least in terms of the U.S. Congress and this commission. We really do understand what's going on, and you have helped us, the three of you and Mr. Kramer before he left, to have a much better sense of the threats that are occurring there. I'll ask really all of my questions in the interest of time, then yield to Mr. Cohen, just so whichever ones you would like to respond to, I would ask that you do. Starting first of all with a more general question, do you think that the Ukrainian government is showing any signs of responding to the force, the pressure, if you will, really just calling on the Yanukovych government to just simply do what it ought to do and it has promised to do with regards to those they've jailed, including and especially Prime Minister or former Prime Minister Tymoshenko? And are they at all listening, or are they tone deaf with regards to the very real issues you've raised about the upcoming election? It seems to me if you plan it to or rig the election, you're going to get the outcome you like. And secondly, on the